Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Morgan. I'm giving a presentation here on the Tokyo war crimes trial for the Oken Gakkai. This presentation will be in English. If you're looking for the presentation in Japanese, there's another one in Japanese. If you search just a little bit longer, you should be able to find it. 日本語での発表はもう少々検索すれば、すぐ出ると思いますので、日本語が望ましいと思う方は、どうぞご検索ください。The topic that I've been given for the Oken Gakkai is the Tokyo war crimes trial. And today I want to do a very brief presentation on the Tokyo war crimes trial in the light of race issues, race problems. The reason I want to do that is because in the United States lately there's been, of course, a great deal of turmoil in American society over issues of race and racism and what's called systemic racism. It's October of 2020 now, and we're moving towards an election, and so all of the political situations in the United States are heating up, and the race question has been at the front of national discourse for the past year, at least. And there's been a great deal of violence and arson and looting and unrest purportedly about the racial question. I have my doubts about whether it's entirely sincere, but at any rate, the racial question is at the forefront of many people's minds in the United States right now. And many people are not thinking about the Tokyo war crimes trial. It seems like ancient history. But I think it's important to revisit the Tokyo war crimes trial. And there are many other scholars in this series who are doing that with a great deal of insight into what the Tokyo war crimes trial represents and the history of the Tokyo war crimes trial. In this very short lecture, I'd like to talk just very briefly about the Tokyo war crimes trial and racial questions in the United States and in Asia and in Europe. And the reason I want to do that is, of course, because of what's going on in the United States right now, and also because, due in large part to that, I've spent the last 6 months or so learning more about racial history in the United States, North America, in East Asia, and Europe. And so I've been reading some books on the racial aspect of history in Japan, especially history between Japan and the United States, the relationship between the two countries. And a very good book that I've just finished is this book called Race War. I know the title is backwards, but Race War is a book written by Gerald Horne, who is a very famous historian in the United States, and he spent, I believe, a year or so studying in Hong Kong. Must have been more than 20 years ago. And as a result of that, Professor Horne became interested in some of the racial questions that helped define the history of Japan and East Asia in the 20th century. So Dr. Horne focuses on racial questions, the racial history of the United States, and he's also interested he's written some books about Africa, racial questions in Africa, social questions in Africa. And this book is interesting to me because it's largely about Japan. And it focuses on Hong Kong. A lot of the archival materials that that Dr. Horne uses are from Hong Kong. And I got to thinking more about what's called the Horne Thesis. There's a scholar named Eric McDuffie who wrote a piece that came out about an essay that came out about 10 years or so ago. I believe it was 2011, on what's called the Horne Thesis. And the Horne Thesis is the combination, according to McDuffie, the combination of black and red in the American 20th century, and especially the American wars, participation in World War II, and then the Cold War. So as Duffy characterizes the Horn thesis, the black was the racial question in the United States, and then the red was the political question, the question of communism, and that those things are related, or they're actually linked, the black and the red. So the question of white supremacy was made problematic by the white Americans' battle against Japan, and then against Russia, Soviet Union in the Cold War, and that the example of Japan in many ways showed the hypocrisy of the American government in its war claims, in what it claimed was the aims for which it was fighting, the war in the Pacific, the war in Europe, and then after that the Cold War. To state it very briefly, the Horn thesis, as McDuffie characterizes it, is that the Americans said that they were fighting for freedom and democracy in Asia, but obviously there was a racial component to that. The 442nd was a regiment composed of Japanese Americans who were sent to Europe because they were thought to be untrustworthy if they were to be sent to fight against Japan, that they would somehow change sides because of their racial background. And of course, black and white troops were segregated in the armed forces, and there were very, very few black officers. There were very, 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 very few black. I think there was only one who was in command of white troops, and many black servicemen were cooks in the Navy, or they were doing yeoman's work, cleaning and cooking and doing work behind the front lines, and they were kept segregated from the white troops, and so it was a nakedly segregated military, which claimed to be fighting for freedom and democracy, which seemed quite hypocritical to many blacks at the time, and to many other sensitive people, thinking people at the time. And the Horn thesis is that Japan shows the hypocrisy of this, and that the Americans fought for racial supremacy in East Asia and the rest of the world, while also veiling that, or draping that with rhetoric about freedom and democracy and individual rights and that sort of thing. Okay, I think that's definitely true, and I'm not here to dispute that. I think the Horn thesis is as McDuffie characterizes it, is definitely true. Many black thinkers in the pre-war in the United States actually looked to Japan. One of them, of course, is this gentleman, Webb Du Bois. I know the book is turned around here, but Webb Du Bois was an American intellectual who wrote very famously that the issue of the 20th century would be the issue of the color line, and I think he was absolutely right about that. That the main issue of society, of the world in the 20th century was racial segregation and racial discrimination, and to put it even more provocatively, white supremacy, which is the term that Horn uses throughout his book, is white supremacy. It's even on the cover. The title is White Supremacy and the Japanese Attack on the British Empire. Now, while that's definitely true, and while white supremacy was definitely the organizing principle of certainly British rule over India and Southeast Asia, French rule over Southeast Asia, the British and the Germans and the French in Africa, for example, British and the French in West Indies. People often forget that the rule of, say, Barbados or Haiti or Jamaica was horrific, and it was the white people, the white plantation owners, by and large, while there were some free blacks and there were actually some blacks who were slave owners, the vast majority of slave owners were white, and the people who were working in the fields were black. And the idea of white supremacy, that blacks worked in fields and whites accrued and to whites accrued the fruits of their labor was the bedrock of that society and of the British rule of India and of the Americans in the Philippines and I would also argue of the American war against Japan, that non-white civilizations were simply not allowed to follow the path of colonialism and imperialism that the Europeans had followed. That's been repeated so many times that it's almost cliched, but Horn actually brought it out and gave it a much clearer political valence, especially from within the United States. Now, my critique of Horn is that he takes into account a lot of American history, but he does not really take into account Japanese history enough. So that his thesis is flawed insofar as it does not give credence to the war aims as expressed by the Japanese. Now, I think that's a very important point, and I think it changes everything, actually. Horn is very critical of Du Bois because Du Bois was a very big supporter of Japan before the war, and indeed many blacks, for example, intellectuals in Harlem, thought that Japan, they actually cheered for Japan when they won the Russo-Japanese War, when they defeated this Slavic empire, and they cheered for Japan when Japan raced into Hong Kong and kicked the British out of Hong Kong, and they were cheering for Japan as Japan extended its hand to freedom fighters in India, Southeast Asia, or in China. Du Bois gives credence to that argument, but Horn doesn't so much. And I think Du Bois is actually right. And I think that the deeper that you get into Japanese history, East Asian history, I think the more you can see that. So for me, whereas the Tokyo war crimes trial was touted as the Nuremberg of Tokyo, where victorious allies who had fought righteously in their righteous might, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt put it, against tyranny, were expressing the judgment of civilization. And by that I think they meant Western European civilization upon barbarians, in the way that they put it, people who had committed crimes against humanity. Whereas in the European case, I think that was definitely true. I think it is a fallacy, and beyond that, it is actually scandalous and defamatory to say that Japan was in any way doing something akin to what the National Socialists in Western Europe were doing. I've been reading Hannah Arendt lately, and Hannah Arendt is fantastic. I would recommend her to anyone. And Hannah Arendt makes the point, which I think is absolutely true, that the Nazis were trying to commit a crime that was worse than what anybody had ever done before. They were trying to make the very meaning of the word crime evacuated. They were trying to overturn the idea of crime itself, to commit a crime that was so heinous and notorious and big that it would forever undermine the very idea of criminality. They were trying to make crime the basis of human endeavor, and what they were actually trying to do was destroying European Jewry was just the beginning for the Nazis, as Arendt points out. They as Arendt says, they thought in terms of centuries, as they themselves lauded themselves at the time. The Nazis said that they were thinking in terms of centuries, and they were instigating a race war, which was not really for the sake of the Germans. That was just a pretense at the beginning, and it wasn't just to destroy the Jews. That was just how they were getting started. That they were going to transform the entire globe into a paradise for National Socialists who could only be this Aryan race, which was a complete invention, and which was not the definition of Aryan was not coterminous with the definition of Germans. You've got the party which hijacks the country and then destroys it, it's arguable whether Hitler actually wanted to win World War II or not. The invasion of Russia was disastrous. Everybody could see it. At the time, his generals told him not to do it. If he had read Tolstoy's War and Peace, if he had studied European history and what Napoleon had tried to do, he would have known. Anybody who had been to grammar school in Europe would have known invading Russia is a very bad idea and it destroys your empire. He did it anyway, and I don't think that was because he was stupid. I think that's because he wanted to destroy Germany. That these people were much more insane than most of us believe, Arendt points out in her book, and I think rightfully so. I recommend Arendt if you're interested in history of totalitarianism, and she is not easy on the Bolsheviks either. Hitler and Stalin admired one another, and they learned from one another. That tells you a lot. Japan, in my view, was totally different. What Japan was trying to do was not instigate a race war. In fact, Japan was trying to liberate races from white supremacy. I think that's absolutely true. Webb Du Bois could see that. Horn even grants it, actually. I think Horn overdetermines white supremacy in some ways because he doesn't give Japan credit for its stand against white supremacy. I think Horn tends to see Japan also through a lens of racial supremacy, but I think if you examine the history of the time, Japan was doing something very different. Their concept was Hakko Ichiyu, which is an organizing principle for diversity of races, and it's centered in a given polity and a given tradition, and it extends outwards benevolently. And the Daitowa Kyoeiken, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, was, I think, an iteration of the Hakko Ichiyu, or the all-embracing idea of racial harmony of peoples, that Japan was trying to use as a substitute for the white supremacy that was definitely in place in East Asia, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Latin America at the time. I think that's apparent to all candid minds. I would say that if Professor Horn had specialized in East Asian history, he might have arrived at a similar conclusion. Whereas he's definitely correct about white supremacy. I think there's no doubt about that. I think there's a lot more that can be said about East Asian history, and especially what Japan did. And so, in my view, the Tokyo War Crimes trial, it's not just victor's justice, as we often hear, although it is that. I think Richard Manier got it right in his volume Victor's Justice, which is interesting. Remember that Manier was writing during the Vietnam War, and his book was a kind of protest against Yankee imperialism in Southeast Asia. So when he says victor's justice, I think he's talking about the United States government more than just white people. But I think what Horn, the service that Horn does, is that Horn says, wait a minute, you can't talk about the United States government without talking about racial ideas of racial superiority and white supremacy. I think that that's also very true at the time. The drive to quote unquote save Southeast Asia from the communists, while I think it would have been noble, was unfortunately marred by racial hatred. So my corrective to the Horn thesis, I would say, is that while the red and the black probably do go together in the case of the United States, I think it's clear that Americans had to confront their own racial prejudices while they were confronting the challenge of the Soviet Union. I think that's definitely true. You remember Muhammad Ali, who was approached by Russians and asked very provocatively, even taunted, you might say, why are you a patriotic American when this is how black people are treated in the United States? And he forcefully pushed back and said, Russian, I'm an American. But blacks had to answer that question, whereas whites did not. No one would say, unless you were someone like Lee Harvey Oswald, who had spent time in the Soviet Union, unless you were a deviant, people assumed in the United States that if you were a white person, you were probably a patriotic American. Whereas black people got asked the question, why are you a patriotic American? If this is how you and your your fellow black people are treated in the United States. And so this is an internal question that the Americans had to confront while they were fighting the Cold War. So in that sense, the Horn thesis, as presented by McDuffie, and I think if you read Horn, you get the same idea, is correct. The black and the red, they did go together in the United States. You can't separate them. Blacks fighting for freedom, and then blacks fighting for freedom abroad, which they did not own, did not have at home, and then the political struggle, the communist, the class struggle. I think those are definitely linked. Those are connected. I think that's true. But in the case of Japan, I think we have to understand that you can separate color, the color question, the race question, from the communism question. And the Tokyo War Crimes trial doesn't understand that at all. The Japanese were fighting not only against white supremacy, but also against communism in the end. And I think it's very important to admit that they were doing that. And I have a very positive view of what Japan was trying to do in the pre-war and in the Second World War. Granted that Japan was also acting for its own benefit. I'm not saying that history is filled with altruists. I don't believe that. But at the same time, I think Japan was making an effort to do a service to Southeast Asia, and East Asia, and that Japan, Horn wants to see Japan through an American lens, but Japan was doing something in Asia. That's what Japan was doing. And in order to fight supremacy in Asia, you couldn't just write strongly worded letters to the editor of a newspaper. You had to fight, and you had to have white supremacy in East Asia was not something that someone sketched from the back of an envelope. It wasn't an idea. It wasn't an academic principle. It was a real thing, and it was maintained through a great deal of violence. It was the British rule of India, while not as bad as, say, King Leopold's rule of Congo. That was a horror of horrors. It was still based upon violence, and the Japanese takeover of Hong Kong, I think, shows what the Sikh or the Indian troops in the British Empire and the British military really thought about how they were treated. There was segregation, and couldn't enter the officers' club with the white officers, and discrimination in promotion and in pay. The way that they were treated, the jobs they were given, used as cannon fodder, send the Indian troops or the Zulu troops, whatever, the black troops out in the front, and protect the white troops in the back. I mean, that's definitely true, I think, and Japan was trying to overturn that. I think that has to be admitted. But they weren't trying to do it communistically. I think the Japanese leaders also understood that communism was just as pernicious as racism. I think that has to be admitted in the case of Japan, and that, in my view, that complicates the Horn thesis quite a lot, I think, and I'm going to be studying that more as I go forward. Whereas I'm not trying to deny the Horn thesis at all. I do think that it can be updated and it can be revised, I think, to take into account that Japan was trying to overcome white supremacy in Asia actively. And to do that, they had to fight against Europeans, but they also had to propose another kind of organizing principle so that Asia didn't descend deeper into chaos once the white people left. Japan had a very good intelligence system service at the time. Many people don't think of Japan as being a spy powerhouse today. Japan is a spy paradise because there's not really any law that says you can't spy. Incredibly, it's a sitting duck. That's why it's so easy, for example, for North Koreans to come to Japan and kidnap people, because the North Koreans knew that nothing would happen to them. There's no law. It's like It's like the fox walks into the kitchen, into the chicken coop, and all the doors are open. Okay, the fox will take chickens. Uh, but Japan is not known for its prowess in espionage today. At the time, they had a very good idea of what was going on in the rest of the world, especially Russia, China, Southeast Asia. They were very well informed, and we have to remember that China at the time was chaos, and that when Japan saw that Russia, which had become the Soviet Union, was pressing deeper into Asia, and also the Comintern and other Soviet agents were trying to manipulate Chinese politics, the Chinese military. Japan understood this perfectly, and they saw that it wasn't enough just to evict the white people, that there was another virus that was abroad in Asia. It was not just white supremacy, it was also communism. And I think that the black and the red is connected there, but in that sense, Japan was trying to separate the black from the red, which is to say they were trying to defeat the idea that white supremacy was the only organizing principle of non-white societies. And they were also trying to propose another way of organizing society that was not communistic, that was not ideological, that was more organic, that was based upon a much more traditionally Japanese conception of interpersonal harmony, which was not predicated upon some ideology like communism, socialism, or anarchism, or fascism, or whatever the ism of the day was. That Japan was trying to do something different than that, and that was their solution, as they saw it, to white supremacy in Asia. Tokyo War Crimes Trial doesn't admit any of that. It simply lumps Japanese leaders together with Nazi leaders as war criminals and puts them on trial for a crime against humanity, when, as Horn, I think, would agree, the real crime against humanity, and setting aside what the Nazis did, I mean, this is why you have to separate Nuremberg and Tokyo, because what the Nazis did was most certainly a crime of unprecedented proportion. What Tokyo did was not a crime. I think what Tokyo did was actually heroic. What Tokyo did, trying to liberate Asia from white supremacy, was actually quite, should be lauded, I think, and they shouldn't be blamed. So my view of the Tokyo War Crimes Trial is that it was a sham. It was a kangaroo court, a show trial, to facilitate American advance into Asia, to set the stage for the American occupation of Japan, to neutralize Japan permanently, to instill in Japanese part of what's called the War Guilt Information Program, WGIP, to tell the Japanese people that they had done something horrible, which psychologically neutralizes them so that the Americans can have their way in East Asia. I think that's what the war crimes trial in Tokyo was about. It was not about actually trying Japanese on the merits. It was a stage play. It was a morality play, and the Japanese were forced to play the role of the evil black-hatted villain, was twisting his mustaches and trying to rule the world, when in fact it was the Americans who were taking over from the British Empire at the time. But the example of Japan after that forced the Americans into a new paradigm. It could no longer be just white rule. It had to be an ideological rule. And so the Cold War, which was an extension, I think, of the British Empire, the Americans had taken over systematically. The Americans have been trying to do this. It didn't fall in their lap. This is the Americans. I think we have to give them a little more credit, that they were a lot more clever than we think they were. They didn't just wake up one day and we've got the British Empire. They coveted it, and the imperialists were trying to get it. The American imperialists were trying to get it from the beginning. So the American Empire was an extension of the British Empire, and in that sense, it was based upon the idea of white supremacy. That was the bedrock. But Japan forced the United States to change their paradigm. So it could no longer be ostensibly about race. It had to be about an idea. It had to be about freedom and democracy and free trade and whatever the ideas were that were advanced to counter Soviet influence, communist influence in East Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe, in the United States, in Latin America. It was no longer race. It was about freedom and democracy. And Japan forced that change, not just through the war, but after the war. The Americans in Japan, black soldiers who married Japanese women, were told at first they could not bring their brides back home because there were anti-miscegenation laws in place in the United States. Remember that Loving versus Virginia was not until much later, so there were still anti-miscegenation laws on the books. Black people could not marry white people. Asian people could not marry black people. It was forbidden. So the black Americans who had gone to Japan saying they were fighting for freedom and democracy didn't have the freedom to bring their wives back to the democracy. It didn't make much sense to them, and it didn't make much sense if most people thought about it. And so Japan continued to be a witness. And also the Japanese, I think you have to remember, the Japanese kept fighting in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam. There was a lot of Japanese vigilantism after the war, and the Japanese also continued to bear witness in other ways to the paradigm that they had suggested, which is no white supremacy, no communism, but shared prosperity. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was a real thing. It was a real idea. It wasn't just window dressing, and it had a real valence, and it continued after the war. I think it had a great deal of continuity. That's my update to the Horn thesis, and that's how I think we should revisit the idea of the Tokyo War Crimes trial. It was victor's justice, but you also have to bring Horn to bear, and also Webb Du Bois, and also this book is very good, Yuichiro Onishi's book, Trans-Pacific Anti-Racism, which gives a good idea of how Japanese scholars, in part, helped change minds in the United States about African history, about the African diaspora, and so forth. Thank you for listening. I hope this has been helpful. This is work that I'm still doing, so I'm just starting this big project here on race in the Pacific. It's a huge topic, and I've got a lot of work to do, but I hope to keep plugging away at it, and I'll look forward to the chance to discuss it with all of you in more detail later on. Thank you very much for listening.